Employment interviews, the most common method of selection definitely is an employment interview, normally conducted by the manager of the vacant position and some upper level managers. HR sometimes screens people and that sort of thing. Um, and normally interviews have kind of poor reliability. And we'll talk about some that do and some that don't. There can be a lot of bias, that sort of thing. Interviews nowadays can be conducted in other ways than face to face. Skype is an online sort of communication tool, which some of you are familiar with. When I was interviewed at USM, I was in North Carolina and I interviewed with Dr. Duhan and Dr. Parafit through Skype. So that's kind of interesting. I'm sitting on the couch and in my living room, kind of just chatting with them. A lot of venues like Second Life, video conferencing, because it's really expensive to have to fly people, from one place to another for an interview. So a lot of companies, especially for screening, are using techniques like this. So you may want to kind of get familiar with that. It's a little bit different when you have to do it. So there are different types of interviews, and I talked about validity. Um, some interviews have a lot of validity, like a structured interview, because structured interview has a list of standard questions that are asked of every applicant, and then oftentimes has a scoring rubric with it. So it has a pretty good higher degree of reliability and validity versus an unstructured, which is kind of, you go in and they, tell me something about yourself and just kind of chat, sort of. That doesn't have a lot of validity. Excuse me. Semi-structured is where you have a list of questions, but the interviewer is also allowed to kind of go off and ask things that kind of come up through the process. Situational interview has also very good validity, and this is where the interview asks about specific situations and how an applicant would react. This could have been in a past job or a hypothetical situation. So it has a better validity. It's a good predictor of performance. For instance, if I'm interviewing for an HR job, I could be asked, what would you do if someone came to you on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock claiming they were the victim of sexual harassment? What would you do? Okay, so I would have to explain, and hopefully I wouldn't say, oh, it's Friday, I just kind of go home, but probably wouldn't be the right answer, but you kind of get the idea. Um, a lot of tests are given, mental ability tests, IQ tests. And one of the most famous ones is the Wonderlic IQ test, and I gave you a link that you could go in and look at these questions. And this is the test also used for, very famous with the NFL. Okay, they use this test to determine the intelligence level of football players, and it's kind of interesting. So you might want to kind of look into that. I think it's a very interesting application of this. Okay, and then there's personality tests that we can give that kind of gauge someone's personality, because sometimes that's hard to tell in a job interview. But I think in this case we could also have a few legal problems, especially if you start asking personal questions. You have to be concerned with privacy laws. So I'd be kind of careful, with this one as well. And what we're trying to do is drill down to the big five personality types, and I don't know if you've ever looked at this. The five personality types have been identified, and we can measure people's, kind of on a scale where they fall. And employers are looking for, of these five, they're looking for conscientiousness. And that only makes sense because that tells if someone's dependable and if they're a hard worker and that sort of thing. So conscientiousness is, pretty important really in any job. Okay, then work sample tests. A lot of validity in work sample tests because we're asking someone to actually perform something they would do on the job. Okay, I could ask someone to do an Excel spreadsheet for me, give them instructions. I could ask someone if it's for a computer hardware job, I could have a computer all taken apart and say, put this together and tell me what the parts are. Okay, so it's a lot of validity in that sort of thing because it does measure the job. you have to be careful. Safety problems. I wouldn't ask someone, here, show me how you drive a forklift, because obviously they could, cause some sort of damage or something like that. Um, Assessment centers are used for management positions, and it's very expensive. So it's kind of top managers, and this is where a manager would go to a place for normally a couple days up to a week and do different activities. They would lead a discussion group, they would go through an in basket of memos and respond to them. So lots of validity, but very expensive. Okay. Then, oh, here's a question if you want to ask. And this is one we talked about in our in my face-to-face class. Which one do you think has the highest validity and reliability? Not sure there's definitely a definite correct answer. So then we want to also be concerned with dysfunctional behavior. We don't want employees coming in that are addicted to drugs or dishonest employees. So most employers give drug tests, to applicants. And some jobs that's legally mandated, jobs like Department of Transportation, pilots, people who work in nuclear power plants. That's all good stuff. You don't want them to be drug addicts in those kinds of jobs. Um, However, you have to be concerned sometimes with false positives, and oftentimes you have a policy where you have a second test or a physician speaks to the applicant, so you have to have some sort of procedure how you handle those situations, because there will be situations. Okay. Then we have dishonesty. We have polygraph tests, which are illegal except in the public sector. Interestingly enough, there could kind of analyze that for a while. But the private sector isn't allowed to use those. But the private sector does um, honesty tests, and I have an example of that on the assignment sheet as well. And those are always kind of interesting. So go look at that. Then we have tort laws. We have to be concerned with tort laws, and this is just civil laws that cover people who subject people to unreasonable risk. Okay, and what we're really talking about here is negligent hiring. And I kind of mentioned that before, where if, or defamation, where if I give information out that is untrue about someone and it harms them, that's defamation. But if an employer gives information on someone that's true, and the truth can be verified, and the information's only given to those who are interested parties, that's not defamation. But most employers have a blanket policy about this. We're not gonna give out this information, which which is difficult if you're trying to hire people, because then you're subjected to negligent hiring, which means if I don't check someone out, like let's say I'm hiring someone to be a security guard, and I didn't check them out, and they were convicted of rape earlier, and I hire them and put them in a position of of authority, and then they end up harming someone, a customer or another employee, I'm going to be sued for negligent hiring, which is huge. Okay, so you have to be really careful, like I said, especially with these duty of care positions. Certainly anyone dealing with children. So anyway, this is the end, and make sure you remember Alice this time. She's the engineer, very competent engineer that works in the Dilbert office. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed Chapter 7, and you could kind of relate to it through your own experience and kind of think about those things. I think it's interesting how organizations go about doing these things. So with that, I guess we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.